Hi, in this session we'll study the structure of the human heart or the anatomy of the human heart. The word anatomy means structure. Now the human heart, for the sake of understanding it simply, can be divided into three divisions: the chambers, the valves and the vessels. Let us have a look at the chambers of the human heart. Now here we have a diagram of the human heart. The human heart is made up of four chambers: the two upper chambers and the two lower chambers. The two upper chambers, you can see this is one of the chambers, this is the second chamber, this is the third chamber here, and then we have the larger fourth chamber here. The two upper chambers are called auricles or atrium. I prefer using the word auricle. Now there are two auricles, the upper auricles. This is called the left auricle and this is the right auricle. Now remember, the left auricle is the left of the specimen right in front of me. It is not my left. So the left side of the human heart here will be to my right hand side. Anyways, so you got the two auricles, the left auricle and the right auricle. The other two chambers are the lower two chambers here, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. The four chambers are connected to each other and also are separated from each other in certain ways. What do I mean by this is that the left auricle is connected to the left ventricle and the right auricle is connected to the right ventricle. However, the left side of the human heart is completely separated from the right side of the human heart. The left side of the human heart and the right side of the human heart are completely separated by a wall which is called the septum. Here we have the septum, and here the term interventricular septum has been used, but you can simply use the term septum. The functions of the four chambers are very specific. The auricles have the function of receiving blood, and the ventricles have the function of pumping the blood out of the heart. Let us have a brief look into the functioning of each of the chambers. The left auricle receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs. So let me just use the marker. The left auricle, let's use a thicker marker. The left auricle here, left atrium, receives the oxygenated blood from the lungs via certain blood vessels, which we'll talk about later. This blood from the auricle or the left auricle is pumped into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pushes this or pumps this blood out into this big massive vessel called the aorta. Similarly, on the right hand side of the human heart, we have got the right auricle, which receives deoxygenated blood from the body and brings it inside the human heart. And then this deoxygenated blood, oxygen deficient blood, is then pumped into this lower bigger chamber called the ventricle, and then ventricle pumps this blood out of the heart towards the lung where the blood will be oxygenated. Now let us look at some other differences between the chambers. Now the walls of the auricles are thinner in comparison to the walls of the ventricles. You can see the walls of the ventricles are extremely thick and the walls of the auricles are comparatively thin. The reason for this is that the pressure inside the ventricles is extremely high compared to the auricles. The auricles receive the blood oxygenated in the left, deoxygenated in the right, and when they pump this blood, they just have to pump the blood into these ventricles, right? That is their only job, to receive the blood. The job of the auricles is to receive the blood and pump the blood into the respective ventricles. So their function is only to pump the blood through this distance. However, when the ventricles contract, they have to contract the blood or push or pump the blood with extreme force so that the blood can reach all the parts of the body or to the lungs. And that's why they generate huge amounts of pressure. As the pressure generated inside the ventricles is so huge, they can also collapse. And that's why, in order to protect itself, the ventricles have a much thicker wall. So this was all about the 4 chambers of the human heart. Now let us have a look at, so we are done with the chambers, and now let us have a look at the valves. Now what does the word valve mean? Valve means a gate. So valve, the term valve means a gate. And there are around 5. There are 5 valves in the human body, right? In the human heart, I mean. Now let us have a look at those valves. Now the function of the valve is to prevent the backflow of the blood, right? So let us have a look at the movement of the blood into the heart. Let us start from the left atrium. Now the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and the blood arrives here from different parts. We'll talk about where the blood comes into the auricle later. So the blood has entered the auricle, and from here the auricle then contracts. We'll understand what that is called in greater details later. So the auricle contracts, it squeezes, and it pushes the blood here into the ventricle. Now when the ventricle contracts, if the ventricle contracts, it contracts with a great force. It can push the blood back. In order to prevent this backflow, so that the blood does not go back, there is this gate. I hope you can see this white colored structure here. These are the valves. They act like gates. So they basically close like this. And then they can also open. Right. So the function of the valve is to act like a door. So when the blood enters the ventricle, and when the ventricle contracts, before the contraction of the ventricle, this valve closes. So when the ventricle contracts, the blood has to move to some place, and it moves here into this gigantic vessel called the aorta. Right. Now this aorta runs from here to here. So ventricle, the left ventricle is connected to the aorta. And while this is happening, the valve stays closed so that the blood does not move back into the auricle. Now this was the first valve. Now I hope you can appreciate that the valve is between an auricle and a ventricle, and that's why this valve is called a atrioventricular valve, or an AV valve. We'll get into the details of this in a little while. The same kind of valve is present on the right hand side of the heart, human heart. Here the deoxygenated blood, and deoxygenated blood is received by the right auricle, and there are these 2 blood vessels. These ones in blue, these are called the vena cavas. They bring in the deoxygenated blood into the right auricle. The right auricle receives it, and this deoxygenated blood is then moved, is squeezed, is pushed into the right ventricle, this massive chamber here. Now this we'll understand how this all happens in greater details, but let us just understand for the moment that the blood moves into the right ventricle. Now when the right ventricle contracts again, it can push the blood back into the auricles, and in order to prevent that, again we have a valve here. You can see this white tissue underneath, and this white tissue acts like a flap. It's like a gate. It's like a gate. It's like this. This valve is like this. This valve is like this. So these 3 flaps, they basically open up and the valve is open, and when they join together, the valve is closed. Right. So this valve, when it closes, it prevents the backflow of the blood. Now the ventricle can contract, and when the ventricle contracts, the blood is pushed through this region here out into this massive blood vessel, which is called the pulmonary artery. Now the pulmonary artery eventually branches into 2 parts. We'll understand how and why later. So this is the pulmonary artery. This is also called the pulmonary trunk though. Right. So you can also write it as pulmonary artery. Now this valve, because again it is separating the auricle from the ventricle, this is also called the atrioventricular valve. Let us have a look here. So we've just finished understanding the atrioventricular valves. So we have a left atrioventricular valve and we have a right atrioventricular valve. Let's get back to the diagram and see it. So we have a left AV valve, this valve here, this valve. This is called the left AV valve. Now it has some other names. It is also called a bicuspid valve or a mitral valve. Now why is the left AV valve called a bicuspid valve is something that I'm going to tell you now. Now, cusp means a flap. Now, the left AV valve is made up of two flaps. This is one of the flaps and this is one of the flaps, and that's why it's called a bicuspid valve also. The left AV valve is also called the bicuspid valve. Another name for the left atrioventricular valve is called the mitral valve. And this is one of those valves, the mitral valve. Similarly, the right AV valve is known by one more name, and that is the tricuspid valve, because it is not made up of this valve here is not made up of two flaps but rather three flaps. I hope this much is clear to you. So much about the AV valves, their names and their functions. Now let us look at some other valves. Now again, let us start from the left side of the human heart. When the blood is now pumped by the left ventricle, when ventricle contracts, the left ventricle contracts, the AV valve is closed. The mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, it's one and the same thing. When it is closed, the blood is pumped. When this blood is pumped, it moves into the aorta. This is a massive blood vessel, one of the major blood vessels. So the blood moves into it. So now the blood is inside the aorta, and what will happen right shortly after this is that the ventricle will again open up. It had contracted, now it will again relax. As it relaxes, the blood in the aorta can come back, right? Because when it opens up, the pressure will be low here, but here inside the aorta there will be very high blood pressure, right? So the blood can flow back. In order to prevent this backflow of the blood from the aorta into the left ventricle, we have a valve. Let me use a green marker for this. We have a valve here. I hope you can see those two lobes out there. They are actually two flaps. So these are flap-like structures, and this is another of the valves. And this valve is called the aortic valve. Here, aortic valve. Why is it called the aortic valve? Because this valve is present between the left ventricle and the aorta. And that's why it's called the aortic valve. Now let us try to understand another valve close by. And that valve is present between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. Now, when the right ventricle contracts, it pushes the blood into the artery, into the pulmonary artery, not just the artery, the pulmonary artery. The word pulmonary means lungs. So this blood is supposed to go to the lungs, to the left lung and to the right lung, right? So anyways, so what happens when the right ventricle relaxes now? It has now pushed, it has pumped the blood. Now eventually it will have to relax. It will have to expand again to receive blood from the auricle, the right auricle. So as it relaxes, the blood can flow back from the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle. In order to prevent this backflow, we have another valve right here. I hope you can see those two structures here. Can you see these two structures? These two bracket-like structures. These two flaps are actually representing the valve. And this valve, which is present between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, is called the pulmonary valve. This is called the pulmonary valve. Now, there are some other valves which we do not need to understand for our level of understanding, but anyways, there is no harm. Now, there is another valve which prevents the backflow of the blood from the heart. Now, remember, when the blood is brought to the left ventricle, the blood is entering at a very low pressure, because this is venous blood. This blood has traveled throughout the body and is coming back with extremely low pressure. Here, these two particular vessels, this is called the superior vena cava and this is called the inferior vena cava. They are bringing the deoxygenated blood and the blood is at extremely low pressure. Now, because the superior vena cava here is bringing the blood from the superior part of the body, from the top part of the body here, this blood flows under the effect of gravity. So there is basically no chance of this blood to flow back, because the gravity is anyways going to pull this blood down. However, the deoxygenated blood that is entering from the inferior vena cava, this major blood vessel, into the auricle contracts. The moment the auricle contracts due to high pressure, this blood can also flow back into the vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and hence there is a valve out here guarding the base or the entry of the inferior vena cava. And this, even though that valve has not been shown in the diagram, this valve here is called the valve of the inferior vena cava. Right. Now there is just one more valve, and that valve is also present in the right auricle, and that valve is called the Thebesian valve. Let me just show you the spellings here. This is called that is the last valve, which is called the Thebesian valve. And what is the role of the Thebesian valve? This is very interesting. Now, just like the entire body requires blood for for its requirement of oxygen and nutrients, and for the removal of wastes and carbon dioxide that is produced around due to metabolic reactions. So blood is also supplied to the heart. The oxygenated blood that enters the heart is also supplied to the heart, and there is the system of blood vessels that supplies oxygenated blood to the heart and also receives deoxygenated blood from the heart. Now there are these blood vessels which we'll study later, which are known as the coronary artery. The coronary arteries are at the base of this massive blood vessel called aorta. Let me use a different color here, green. Now you see this is this blood, the large blood vessel called the aorta. At the base somewhere here, we have got two arteries which basically supply blood to the heart, oxygen-rich blood and nutrient-rich blood to the heart. These muscles of the heart, they will use a lot of oxygen, huge amounts of oxygen, and they will also use a lot of nutrients. But once the blood that has been supplied to the human heart becomes deficient of oxygen, once there is a lot of carbon dioxide in it, and once all the nutrients have been spent, that blood is collected back. And that collected blood is deficient in oxygen. And where does the oxygen deficient blood go? To the right auricle. And so somewhere here, where I am drawing this, somewhere here is an opening, and that opening is called the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is basically an inlet of deoxygenated blood coming from the heart. Now there is another valve which guards this coronary sinus, and that valve is called the Thebesian valve. Now let us just look at the valves once again. The most important valves that you must remember are the atrioventricular valves, the pulmonary valves, the aortic valves. That is it. So you are supposed to know these four valves. Now you'll say, why four? Because there are two atrioventricular valves, the left and the right. This makes them 1, 2, and then we have got the pulmonary valve, the third one, and fourth is the aortic valves. You should remember these four valves. However, it will be phenomenal if you can remember the valve of the inferior vena cava and the Thebesian valve. Now the function of the valve of the inferior vena cava is to prevent the backflow of the blood into the inferior vena cava. And the function of the Thebesian valve is to prevent the backflow of blood into the coronary sinus, which has collected the deoxygenated blood from the heart. Anyways, if you don't remember this much, it is alright, but you should at least remember the four major valves. That is the mitral bicuspid, or what we call it the left AV valve. You must remember the right AV valve or the tricuspid valve. You must remember the aortic valve, the valve between the aorta and the left ventricle, and you must also remember the pulmonary valve, which guards the border between the right ventricle and the right pulmonary artery. Just the pulmonary artery, not the right pulmonary artery. This is just the pulmonary artery. Now, so far what we have understood the four chambers, their structures and their functions, and we have understood at least the four major valves and their functions. And now we are going to have a look at the vessels. Now let us go to the slide where we are talking about the vessels. Now there are these 5 major types of vessels, and you have to at least know, you should under all the circumstances learn the first 4 blood vessels. And the last one, that is a supplementary information, and that is, for me, it is pretty interesting. If for you it is interesting, you may remember it, or you may choose to not remember it. Anyways, So the first blood vessel is called the pulmonary vein, the second is called the aorta, and then we got the inferior and the superior vena cava, and finally we got the pulmonary artery. Let us have a look at them in the diagram. Now, starting with, I think we need to rub a little bit of it first, so let us just rub and make it a little clear, the internal structures of the human heart. Let me just wipe out these signs and symbols so that we can understand, we can redraw, and we can point at certain structures clearly once again. So here we go again. I'm going to use the markers again, and let us use the right one. Yep. So now let us have a look at this here. Can you look at this, the right pulmonary veins? And I would like you to also look at, let's rub this also, let us get rid of all of this mess that I've just created, useful mess, and let us have a look at this. And we got the right pulmonary veins, and here we got the left pulmonary veins. Now always remember, the word pulmonary means lungs, and vein is a blood vessel. And what is a vein? Technically correct definition for a vein is any blood vessel that brings blood towards the heart. Any blood vessel which is carrying the blood towards the heart is called a vein. So we've got we'll start with these two major veins called the pulmonary veins. We've got the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary veins. And how many are they? We've got two pulmonary veins which are called the left pulmonary veins. Where are they coming from? They are coming from the left lung, and that's why they are called the left pulmonary veins. They are coming from the left lung. And similarly, we got the right pulmonary veins. Where are they coming from? Yeah, if you guessed it, they're coming from the right lung. And what are they bringing with them? They are bringing oxygenated blood. I hope you know that inside the lungs, the process of oxygenation takes place. So oxygenated blood is brought in by the left and the right pulmonary veins, and a total of 4 veins are there. And what do? They drain the oxygenated blood into the human heart. 1 and 2 and 3 and then 4. Why 4? Because there are 4 pulmonary veins. So these 4 pulmonary veins drain their blood into the left auricle. So I hope we've understood our first major blood vessel and its function. Let's have a look at this. So pulmonary vein, what does it do? Brings oxygen rich. The up arrow is for oxygen rich. Pulmonary veins bring oxygen rich blood from the lungs. They are bringing the blood to the heart, and that's why there is this arrow to the left. Right. Now let us have a look at the next vessel, the aorta. So going back to the diagram. So once the oxygenated blood is inside, from the auricle the blood will move into the ventricle, and from the ventricle the blood will move into the aorta. Now this blood is rich in oxygen, right? Let's use a green marker over the aorta, and here the blood is moving here. It is coming into the left auricle, entering into the left ventricle, moving upwards through the flap aortic valve into the aorta, and from the aorta, this big vessel sends the blood to the superior part of the body, the upper part of the body, which includes your arms, your neck, your head, and to the lower parts of the body below the level of your heart, which are your abdomen. See, here is the aorta. This is again aorta out here. You see, this is the aorta. So the blood is then sent down outside the human heart through this aorta to the inferior part of the body, which are your legs and abdomen, etc. MEN, abdomen, etc. And these aorta also supplies to the superior part of the body, your neck and the arms. Alright, so now let us have a look at the other blood vessels. Now the blood has gone to the different parts of the body, the superior and the inferior parts of the body, and the oxygen inside the oxygenated blood will be consumed. So the blood was rich in oxygen, and now the blood has been the oxygen in the blood has been used, the nutrients in the blood have been used, and the body has now generated carbon dioxide, and the body has also generated the waste which is now put into the blood, and now that blood is being brought back. So the blood now enters into the veins. Now veins are the blood vessels which will bring blood towards the heart. Now what is aorta? Aorta is an artery. because it is carrying the blood away from the heart. An artery carries the blood away from the heart, and a vein brings the blood to the heart. So let us have a look at the major veins which are now going to collect all the deoxygenated blood. Now there are these two major blood vessels. This one, the one in blue right here, is called the superior vena cava. Let us use a different marker. Let us use a blue one to represent that there is deoxygenated blood in them. So let's use a blue marker, and superior vena cava here, this blood vessel here, this one here. The superior vena cava receives deoxygenated blood from the superior part of the body, the neck and the arms, right, and even the upper part of the chest. And then we got the inferior vena cava, which will receive the deoxygenated blood from the lower extremities of the body, the abdomen, the lower part of the chest, and the legs, right. And so these are the next two major blood vessels. These are called the vena cava, the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Now the vena cavas, they will drain their blood, they will move their blood inside the auricles, and from the auricle the blood will move into the ventricle. Which ventricle? Right ventricle. And from the right ventricle, when it contracts, it pushes the deoxygenated blood. Now the blood is deoxygenated. Can you guess where the blood will go? Yeah, if you guessed it, the deoxygenated blood will be pumped to the lungs. So the blood enters the pulmonary artery. This is called the trunk of the pulmonary artery, just like the trunk of the tree or the trunk of the elephant. So the trunk of the pulmonary artery, and the pulmonary artery then divides into two parts. Here is the first and here is the second, and this is where it is coming out from. So why into two parts? Because one of the pulmonary artery, which is called the left pulmonary artery, is going to take the blood to the left lung. And here we have got the right pulmonary artery here, and this right pulmonary artery is going to carry the blood, deoxygenated blood, to the right lung. Now certainly there are large number of terms out here, but you don't have to be bothered about it. With the later practice you can always remember it, and certainly there is a logic behind it. An artery carries the blood away from the heart, a vein brings the blood to the heart. Pulmonary means lungs, right? So let us have a look at what other blood vessels are we left out with. So we have done pulmonary vein. We've done the aorta. The function of the aorta is to take the blood away from the heart. And what kind of blood? Oxygenated blood. Then we've done the inferior and the superior vena cava. What is the function of inferior and superior vena cava? They collect the blood. See the receiving arrow. They collect the blood, bring the blood to the heart from the body which is deficient in oxygen. Down arrow, deficient in oxygen. Then we just finished studying understanding the pulmonary artery. What is the function of pulmonary artery? Its function is to carry the blood to the lungs. How many pulmonary arteries do we have? We have got two, the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Now here is one supplementary artery and vein that you may choose to not study, but if you study it will be a fantastic thing. And let us have a look at this, and which is not shown in the diagram. I'll have to import the diagram sometime later. Now the heart has its own requirements for the blood. So there is an artery which supplies the blood to the heart. Why am I calling it an artery? Because it is first of all taking the blood away from the heart, but where is it carrying to? To the heart itself. So that artery is called the coronary artery. And if you give me a little time, I can show you the coronary artery out here in one of the diagrams. I'll need to shorten this diagram and I'm going to bring it up to you. Just give me a moment so that I can actually work on it and shorten the screen for you guys. So right, so right here we have it. So what do we have here? You see, this is the aorta here, and from the aorta is coming out this red blood vessel, and you see this is called the right coronary artery. Similarly, we have a left coronary artery somewhere out here behind this massive big blood vessel, right? So we got the coronary artery. What is the function of the coronary artery? To supply blood to the heart. And once the heart has consumed all the oxygen and the nutrients present in the blood, all the blood will be sent back into the veins. And what are these called? Coronary veins, right? So coronary artery arises from the base of the aorta, and the coronary vein then collects all the deoxygenated blood. And where does it pump back it into? It pumps the deoxygenated blood back into the coronary sinus. I know it will be very difficult for you at this moment to understand the coronary sinus, which is somewhere here, the coronary sinus somewhere here, right? So coronary sinus is also a point from where deoxygenated blood that is collected from the heart is pumped into the right auricle. So this is all about the structure of the human heart. We'll take a little time to very rapidly revise the different parts of it, and you can see this video over again in order to understand the different parts and their functions better. So let us rapidly revise. The human heart can be studied under three major divisions: the chambers, the valves, and the vessels. How many chambers we have? We've got 4 chambers. We've got the 2 auricles. The upper chambers are called auricles, and 2 ventricles, the lower chambers. The left auricle is connected to the left ventricle. The right auricle is connected to the right ventricle. Both the left and the right hand side of the human heart is separated completely. There is no mixing of blood by a structure called the septum. Then the walls of the auricles are thinner, the walls of the ventricle are thicker. Why? Because ventricles have a very high blood pressure. Then let us have a look at the second part, the second division of the human heart, the valves. There are 4 major valves: the 2 AV valves or atrioventricular valves, because they guard the auricle and ventricle. So the left AV valve is also called the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. The right atrioventricular valve is also called the tricuspid valve. Then we've got the aortic valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. And then we also have another valve which is called the pulmonary valve. And where is this valve present? Between the right auricle and the pulmonary artery. Apart from that, if you remember, and that will be fantastic if you can remember that, we've got 2 more valves. One is called the valve of the inferior vena cava, which is somewhere here, the valve of the inferior vena cava, guarding the inferior vena cava. And we've got one more valve which guards the let us use the red, which guards the coronary sinus. Right, if you can remember these 2, it will be fantastic. Anyways, let's go to the last one, which is called the third division of the human heart, which are the vessels. Right, now there are a large number of vessels. We have got the pulmonary veins, left pulmonary, right pulmonary veins. Then we've got the major artery called the aorta. Then we've got the vena cavas, the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, which are bringing the deoxygenated blood. And finally, we've got this pulmonary artery, one of the parts of which is the pulmonary trunk. We've got the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. And so we have finished our nearly half an hour long lecture on the structure of the human heart. Good luck.